The air in A.F. Condon had a peculiar metallic taste, a blend of coal smoke from the surrounding factories and the cold, damp earth of the approaching winter. It was October 1902, and the town, already grey under the leaden sky, felt heavier than usual. The news had spread not like a flash fire, but like a slow, creeping rot, settling into the joints of the old clapboard houses and the worn faces of the mill workers. Detective Elias Thorne, a man whose coat seemed perpetually too thin for the upstate chill, stepped out of the sheriff's carriage. The gravel crunched under his heavy boots, a sound that felt inappropriately loud in the oppressive silence. Thorne wasn't from the local sheriff's department. He was a private investigator often called in by the state to handle cases deemed too sensitive or too strange for small-town law enforcement. The rising industrial economy had centralized power, but not always justice. He looked up at the house, a modest, well-kept structure on the edge of town, the kind of home that spoke of careful, frugal living. Now the yellow caution tape strung across the porch seemed to strangle it. "Morning, Detective Thorne," greeted Sheriff Ben Carver, a stout man whose badge looked heavy against his woolen vest. Carver's eyes were shadowed, carrying the weight of a dozen sleepless nights. "Didn't expect you until noon. Lost time is lost evidence, Sheriff," Thorne replied, his voice low, his New York City cadence sharp against Carver's slow, upstate drawl. Thorne didn't bother with a handshake. Formalities felt grotesque here. "Tell me again." "Everything." They stood on the porch, where a single, inexplicable object lay on a small side table. A perfectly preserved, slightly charred wooden cross, about a foot high, with a piece of faded crimson cloth wrapped around the intersection. "The Millers," Carver began, rubbing the back of his neck. "Husband, wife, and 2 children. Went to bed Tuesday night. Yesterday morning their neighbors, the Sutherlands, noticed the curtains still drawn at 10. Sent their boy over. The front door was unlocked." "And?" Thorne prompted, his eyes scanning the impeccable lawn, looking for any break in the pattern, any hint of disturbance. "The boy found them, all 4 sitting at the dining room table, all 4 dead. No sign of struggle, no forced entry, no theft. The strange part, the confession." Carver lowered his voice to a hoarse whisper. "They were sitting there staring straight ahead, and on the table next to a half-eaten loaf of bread was a note." Thorne opened the door. The air inside was cold and stagnant, thick with the smell of old furniture and something metallic, something unnatural. The scene was exactly as Carver described, yet worse. The Miller family, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, their daughter Sarah, 16, and son Thomas, 8, were seated around the simple wooden table, their dinner plates neatly arranged. Their eyes were wide, vacant, fixed on the far wall. The lack of blood or visible wounds was its own horror. They looked less like victims of a crime, and more like wax figures abandoned midway through a tableau. Thorne approached the table, careful not to disturb the 2 local deputies standing guard, their faces pale. He focused on the note. It was written in precise, careful script, clearly Mrs. Miller's handwriting, according to the sheriff. "We saw the light. We felt the ash. We have paid the stain. The lamb is new. We await his rising." "Ash and stain," Thorne murmured, his brow furrowed. "A little theatrical, wouldn't you say, Sheriff?" "That's not the half of it," Carver said, handing Thorne a sealed envelope. "The other victims, they had the same note, word for word. We've got 5 other houses just like this in the county, 7 families in 3 weeks, and every single victim was a member of the same congregation." "The new Christ," Thorne said, recognizing the connection instantly. The papers had been saturated with the name, Elias Vance. The preacher from the West who had arrived in A.F. Condon 3 months ago, declaring the conventional church a rotting husk and himself the divine successor. "He calls himself the Lamb of Renewal," Carver corrected, his voice tinged with deep local distaste. "He built a following fast, charismatic. The Millers were some of his first converts. They were decent, simple folk, until this man showed up." Thorne walked slowly around the dining room. He inspected the window latches, locked from the inside. He checked the pantry, fully stocked. Then he saw it. On the baseboard, near the door leading to the kitchen, was a faint, almost invisible trace. A smudge of soot-like powder, grayish-black, mixed with a tiny drop of something dark and viscous. "The ash," Thorne whispered, kneeling for a closer look. He carefully scraped a sample into a small glass vial. "Sheriff, have you searched the church? Vance's meeting place?" "We did 2 weeks ago after the third family," Carver admitted, defensiveness in his tone. "Found nothing, just a humble meeting hall. No weapons, no poisons, nothing that could link him to this. And the preacher? He's still here, preaching every night. He's been cooperative, too cooperative. He gave a sermon last night about the sacrifice being the cost of true salvation. The crowds love it, Detective. They think this is a miracle, a divine rapture. They're flocking to him." Thorne stood up, dusting his trousers. The total lack of resistance and the uniform confession suggested a planned internal event, yet the physical presence of a stain and ash implied an external, perhaps chemical intervention. The true horror lay not in the violence, but in the apparent willingness of the victims. Were they fanatics, or were they victims of a deeply manipulative force? He looked at the small charred cross on the side table again, a symbol of their new faith, left like a calling card. "Sheriff, I need the names and full medical reports of all 7 families. I need to know where Elias Vance is holding his service tonight, and I want a full profile on the man. Everything from his arrival. And Sheriff, that viscous material on the baseboard. I want it analyzed immediately. Send it to the state lab in Albany. Rush order." Thorne's gaze swept over the motionless figures, their silent testimony chilling him far more than any violent crime scene ever could. The ash and the stain. It was the language of ritual, but the execution was cold, clinical, and terrifyingly real. A purely human evil hiding behind the veil of faith. The mystery has only just begun. Who is Elias Vance, and what dark secret is hidden in the ash and the stain? Don't miss the next chapter of this chilling, true crime-inspired investigation. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single step in Detective Thorne's dangerous quest for the truth. The late afternoon sun was a weak, watery thing, barely able to penetrate the smog that perpetually clung to A.F. Condon. Thorne spent the day entrenched in the sheriff's cramped, overheated office, poring over the medical reports. 7 families, 25 victims in total. The cause of death was uniform and unsettlingly vague. Respiratory failure due to an unknown inhaled agent. No burns, no internal hemorrhaging, just a complete, serene shutdown of the body. The victims simply ceased to breathe, with eyes wide open. "They look like they're waiting for a train that's already passed," Thorne muttered, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. Sheriff Carver walked in, a large map of the county pinned to the wall, marking the locations of the sacrifices. "Got the preliminary profile on Elias Vance," Carver announced, dropping a file on the desk. "Minimal paper trail. Born Elijah Vancroft in Indiana, 1865. Changed his name about 5 years ago. Used to be a traveling salesman for farming equipment. Lost everything in a bad crop year, then turned to preaching. He drifted from town to town, Midwest to East Coast, always leaving behind a small, fiercely loyal group of converts, but never staying long. A charismatic salesman turned preacher," Thorne noted, flipping through the sparse pages. "He understands manipulation. Selling salvation is no different than selling a plow, Carver. You just sell hope." "He settled here 3 months ago," Carver continued, pointing to a large, repurposed warehouse on the map. "He calls it the Tabernacle of Renewal. It's a derelict textile mill. He preaches every night, sells his own pamphlets. He even has them selling his holy water, just creek water in a cheap bottle. But the people, they believe. Do they believe enough to willingly poison their own children? Thorne challenged, meeting the sheriff's weary gaze. The notes suggest a group suicide, but the uniform method and the presence of this ash suggest one individual administering the fatal dose. Carver sighed, his finger tracing the path between the last two victims' homes. One of Vance's inner circle, a man named Jesse Holt, runs a small chemical supply shop down by the docks. Sells lye, lamp oil, industrial cleaners to the mills. Holt is devoted to Vance, sleeps outside the tabernacle. Thorne paused. The pieces were beginning to connect. Holt has access to the component for the ash. I need to see the tabernacle tonight, Sheriff. I want to hear the sermon. And I want Holt watched closely. That evening, the biting cold had intensified, driving most sensible citizens indoors. Yet, a steady flow of people was making their way toward the old textile mill. Thorne stood across the street, huddled in his heavy overcoat, the mill's single flickering gas lamp casting long skeletal shadows. The building was vast and imposing, its dark windows like vacant eyes. The interior of the Tabernacle of Renewal was sparse. Bare concrete floors, wooden crates for seating, and a makeshift stage centered with a rough wooden pulpit. The air was dry, dusty, and strangely electric. Elias Vance stood beneath a single blinding gaslight. He was younger than Thorne expected, perhaps mid-30s, with piercing blue eyes and a lean, ascetic face framed by dark, slicked-back hair. His voice was not loud, but utterly commanding, weaving through the packed congregation. You are all stained by the grime of this world, by the sweat of your borrowed wages, by the sickness that creeps into your children's lungs. Vance's hands sliced the air, drawing a gasp from a woman near the front. They tell you God is distant. They tell you salvation is for the next life. I tell you the new Christ is here, and I tell you the path to purity is simple. It is through the ash that we burn the old sin. It is through the stain that we mark our new life. Thorne watched the faces in the crowd. They were the forgotten. Mill workers, tired immigrants, men and women whose hope had been crushed by the relentless industrial machine of 1902 America. Vance was giving them not just hope, but agency. He was giving their suffering meaning. As the sermon reached a fever pitch, a heavy-set man with thick, greasy hair, Jesse Holt, appeared from a side room, carrying a galvanized bucket. He placed it reverently beside the pulpit. The smell that wafted from it was acrid, like cheap disinfectant and something metallic. Jesse Holt, our faithful shepherd, Vance crooned, his eyes locking onto the bucket. He brings us the ash of the world's end, not a curse, my flock, but a cure, a cleaning. You see the stain of this earth, the red rust of your false life. The ash removes it. Thorne focused on Holt. The man's eyes were glassy with devotion, his hands trembling as he lifted a small, charred cross, identical to the one found at the Miller house, and passed it to Vance. Vance held the cross up, letting the harsh light glint off its surface. The Millers, the Clarks, the 5 others, Vance declared, his voice dropping to a hypnotic rumble. They did not perish. They were purified. They stepped over the threshold, leaving behind only the confession of their free will. The world calls it death. We call it ascension. The crowd murmured in awe, some weeping softly. It was clear Vance wasn't just recruiting. He was legitimizing the murders, turning them into martyrs for a greater cause. This wasn't a spontaneous cult. This was a calculated, lethal system of control. Thorne felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The chemical evidence was crucial. He had to know what was in that bucket, and he had to know how Vance was ensuring his victims' compliance. A salesman knows his pitch, and Vance's pitch was fear and transcendence. He backed out of the tabernacle before he could be noticed, the oppressive heat and noise giving way to the sharp, clear cold of the night. He glanced over at Jesse Holt's chemical supply shop, its windows dark. The ash, the stain, and the lamb. Thorne knew the next murder would not be far off. He was hunting a man who was selling the most dangerous product of all, a perfect, beautiful death. The clock was ticking. The Albany lab report arrived the next morning, a thin sheath of official paper that confirmed Thorne's darkest suspicions. He was sitting at a greasy diner counter, hunched over a cup of bitter coffee, when Sheriff Carver delivered the findings. The ash is primarily finely ground coal dust, Detective, mixed with industrial-grade lye, sodium hydroxide. The viscous material, the stain, is human blood, type O negative. Carver looked horrified. The lye is corrosive, obviously, but not lethal if just a trace is on the baseboard. Thorne leaned back, the diner's loud clatter of plates receding as he focused. Coal dust, a cheap product from the mills, and lye, used in soap-making and industrial cleaning which Holt sells, accessible, common. But the blood, that's the key. All the victims had type O negative blood. Yes, every single one of the 25 victims on file, same blood type. Carver frowned. Is that significant? Highly significant, Thorne explained, his voice tight. It means two things. First, the stain wasn't spilled. It was deliberately applied at the scene after the families were already incapacitated or dead. It's a symbolic marker. The criminal is bringing the blood with him, not finding it there. And the second thing, the blood type is O negative, the universal donor. It's a rare coincidence for 25 unrelated people to share it. Unless Vance isn't choosing his victims for their piety alone. He's choosing them for their blood. The thought was chilling. The motivation shifted from a purely religious fanaticism to something far more calculated and medically precise. Thorne pushed his untouched coffee away. We need to talk to Jesse Holt, Sheriff, today, and we need to get a search warrant for his chemical shop. I want to know exactly what he's purchasing and where the type O negative blood is coming from. Getting the warrant for Holt's shop, Holt's Chemical and Supply, was a struggle. Local magistrates were cautious, wary of disturbing a man with a respected business, however fanatical his new faith. It was Thorne's cold, irrefutable evidence of the trace elements that finally convinced them. They found Jesse Holt in the cramped office of his shop, filling out a ledger. He was large and sweaty, his eyes still holding that unsettling, devoted sheen from the night before. Mr. Holt, we need to ask you some questions about Elias Vance, Thorne began, his tone neutral. Holt slammed the ledger shut. The Lamb of Renewal is a good man. He has shown me the light. You are agents of the stained world, trying to drag us back into the mire. We're interested in your relationship with the Millers and the other families, Thorne pressed, ignoring the outburst. You were their supplier for the ash, weren't you? The ash is a sacred cleaning agent, Holt shouted, his hands clenching into fists. It cleans the spirit, it prepares the soul for ascension. I mix it as the Lamb commands. And what does the Lamb command you to mix with the coal dust and lye, Mr. Holt? Thorne leaned closer, forcing Holt to look him in the eye. What is the real poison? Holt's eyes darted nervously to a heavy chained door at the back of the shop. It's not poison, it's the breath of the new life. It's the final step. The argument escalated, drawing in Carver and the deputies, and eventually the warrant was served. The chained room was pried open. The room was not a storage closet for chemicals. It was a makeshift laboratory, crude but functional, dominated by a large, specialized pressure cooker and an array of rubber tubing. But what truly sickened Thorne was the sight of several dozen small empty glass vials and a medical tourniquet, caked with old blood, lying on a wooden bench. Look at this, Sheriff, Thorne said, pointing to a partially opened crate. Inside were dozens of smaller brown glass bottles, all labeled identically in precise, handwritten script. Rapture of air. The breath of the new life. Carver breathed, his face ashen. Thorne picked up one of the bottles. It was heavy, sealed with a thick rubber stopper. The pressure cooker and the tubing confirmed his horrific hypothesis. The victims were being killed by a gas created under pressure. "This is not a suicide, Holt," Thorne stated, holding the bottle up. "This is murder. You are creating a gas that is administered in an enclosed space, causing respiratory failure, and the victims are chosen for their type O negative blood. Why?" Holt crumpled, his devotion giving way to pure terror. "He needs it for the sustenance. He told me it was the final purest offering. He said the new Christ must be sustained by the clean blood of the pure." "Sustenance?" Thorne repeated, the word hanging like a foul odor in the cramped room. He knew the motive couldn't be supernatural, but it had to be deeply, horribly personal and twisted. "What exactly does Vance do with the blood, Holt?" "I don't know," Holt wailed, tears streaming down his face. "I just draw it from the new converts. He says it's for the final blessing, a mark of faith. I only make the gas. He does the rest. He does the purifying." Thorne looked at the collection of bloodied instruments and the rapture of air vials. Vance was not just a cult leader, he was a methodical killer with a terrifying, unknown goal connected to the victim's rare blood type. The mystery was no longer how they died, but why their blood was the price of their salvation. And Elias Vance, the Lamb of Renewal, was still free. The arrest of Jesse Holt sent a tremor through A.F. Condon. The news, though suppressed by the sheriff to avoid a riot, leaked out. The Ascension was a calculated poisoning, but the public, mesmerized by Elias Vance, reacted not with fear but with suspicion towards the authorities. They saw Holt as a simple man, a scapegoat being persecuted by the old order. Thorne knew he had only a small window of opportunity. The discovery of the gas, likely carbon monoxide or a similar fast-acting asphyxiant created by a simple chemical reaction in the pressure cooker, provided the means. Holt had provided the access and the method, but the motive was still hazy, buried in the dark, twisted mind of Vance. The critical piece was the blood. The blood is drawn from new converts as a final blessing before they join the inner circle, Thorne summarized, reviewing Holt's frantic, broken confession. Holt takes a pint or two. He doesn't know what Vance does with it, only that Vance calls it sustenance. "It's barbaric," Sheriff Carver mumbled, pacing the floor. "He's just bleeding them dry before killing them." "No, Sheriff, the victims weren't bled dry. They were poisoned first, then marked with the stain, the type O negative blood, to complete the ritual. The large amount of blood was taken before the poisoning. It's a supply chain. Vance needs that specific blood for something ongoing, something that requires a regular, fresh supply." Thorne picked up the phone receiver, the new invention, a lifeline to the state capital. He needed a medical specialist, a toxicologist, someone who understood rare blood conditions. The local doctor had already dismissed the blood type as coincidence. While waiting for a response, Thorne ordered a complete excavation of Vance's background, this time focusing on medical history, any connection to hospitals or medical personnel. The meticulous nature of the blood selection was too precise for a mere fanatic. It suggested a person with advanced, or at least specialized, knowledge. The afternoon brought a new witness. Mrs. Eleanor Hughes, a recent convert to the tabernacle, but one who had not yet been chosen for the final blessing. She was terrified, drawn to the police station by a nagging, corrosive doubt. "The Lamb. He knows things," Mrs. Hughes whispered, clutching a worn Bible that wasn't Vance's new gospel. "He knew about my husband's lung condition before I ever told him. He knew about the debt we owed to the mill owner." "Mrs. Hughes, tell me about the blessing," Thorne asked gently. "The one Mr. Holt performed." "It's an honor," she said, her eyes vacant with remembered awe. "He calls it the confession of faith. He says the blood carries the taint of the world, and by giving it up, you prepare the vessel for the new Christ's Spirit." She described the process. A private session, in a small, hidden room behind the main pulpit. Vance would sit with them, talking softly about their deepest fears and regrets, while Holt, silent and obedient, would perform the venipuncture. "Did you notice anything unusual about Vance during these sessions?" Thorne pressed. "Did he seem frail? Did he ever mention an illness?" Mrs. Hughes paused, furrowing her brow. "He was always so strong, so vibrant, but sometimes he looked very pale, especially after a late-night meeting, and there were the tremors. He'd shake just a little, and he had a small, raw patch on his arm, near the elbow. He always kept it covered." The pieces slammed into place in Thorne's mind, forming a terrifying mosaic of calculated human exploitation. Rare blood type, paleness, tremors, the need for a constant fresh supply of sustenance. "Sheriff," Thorne said, grabbing the map, his voice edged with urgency, "we're chasing a man who's not trying to save souls, he's trying to save himself." The medical expert called back just as the realization hit its peak. Thorne held the receiver like a weapon. "I have a theory, Doctor. A man with a history of traveling, an intense focus on a rare blood type, symptoms of paleness and occasional tremors. Could it be an extreme case of a chronic debilitating blood disorder, something requiring frequent transfusions?" The specialist's reply, clinical and slow, confirmed the terrifying logic. "It sounds like a form of severe, chronic anemia. Given the time period before modern medicine, his only way to survive a severe, debilitating condition would be regular, direct blood transfusions. If he is specifically selecting O-negative, the universal donor, he is attempting to ensure survival with minimal rejection. Elias Vance was not the new Christ. He was a desperate man with a terminal illness, using his charisma and the crushing hopelessness of the working class in 1902 to secure his own survival. The ascensions were not sacrifices. They were a cleanup operation, eliminating the only witnesses, the donors, to his gruesome, continuous medical fraud. "He's a vampire, Sheriff," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, the words sounding absurdly old-world in the modern office. "A medical predator wrapped in the robes of a preacher. He is not saving his followers, he is harvesting them." Thorne looked at the map. The tabernacle was the center of his operation. The confession of faith was the screening process. The ash was the lethal disposal. And the blood was his life support. Thorne had the motive, and the pieces of the puzzle now pointed to the tabernacle's secret room. The time for surveillance was over. Thorne, Carver, and a reinforced detail of deputies moved under the cloak of a heavy, freezing rain that night. The conditions were perfect. The weather drove the cautious indoors, and the noise of the storm masked their movements. The oppressive urban atmosphere of A.F. Condon, with its smoky air and slick, wet cobblestones, had never felt so menacing. The tabernacle was dark and silent. Thorne instructed the men to secure all entrances, emphasizing that Vance was a predator, not a deity, and was likely armed or protected. He positioned 2 men at the back, near the window of the room where Holt had conducted the bloodletting sessions. Thorne and Carver entered through the main doors, their lanterns cutting weak, dancing cones of light through the vast, empty hall. The air was cold, but beneath the acrid metallic smell from the coal dust lay a faint, yet distinct antiseptic odor, like a doctor's office attempting to hide a great offense. "He's not here, Detective," Carver whispered, his breath clouding in the air. "He's here," Thorne corrected, pointing his lantern beam to a barely visible scrape mark on the wooden floor near the pulpit. "This pulpit isn't just a platform, Sheriff. It's a cover." The base of the pulpit was heavy, bolted down, but after a few minutes of strenuous effort they managed to shift it. Beneath, a thick circular slab of concrete was revealed. It had a small recessed iron ring clearly designed to be pulled. "A hidden chamber," Carver breathed, his hand instinctively resting on his sidearm. "It's a rat's nest." Thorne pulled the ring. The stone slab groaned, revealing a set of steep, rough-hewn wooden steps leading down into absolute darkness. The antiseptic smell was now much stronger, mixed with the faint, warm smell of lamp oil and something organic, like blood and decay. "You wait here, Sheriff. I go first," Thorne ordered. His instincts as a city detective, honed by years of diving into the underbelly of Manhattan, took over. "Like hell I will," Carver retorted, his loyalty to his town overriding his caution. "We go together. This is my town, Detective," Thorne conceded with a curt nod. Together, they descended into the cold, silent bunker. The subterranean room was small, crudely finished, and completely cut off from the outside world. It was lit by a single kerosene lamp that hung precariously from a beam, casting a sickly yellow glow on the scene. The chamber was a terrifying amalgamation of a religious sanctuary and a butcher's shop. A simple cot lay against one wall, clearly Vance's sleeping space. On a rickety table, Thorne saw the objects he'd been dreading. 3 glass jars, each containing a dark, shimmering liquid. Blood. Type O negative, freshly harvested. But the centerpiece of the room was a chair, a large, well-upholstered armchair placed in the center, and beside it, a series of apparatus that confirmed Vance's terrifying medical routine. There was a pump, a rudimentary hand-operated suction device likely adapted from a small water pump, and a complex array of clear rubber tubing connected to sterilized glass containers. Lying on the cot, his face bone-white and drawn, his breathing shallow, was Elias Vance. He was not wearing his preacher's robes but a simple, thin tunic, and his left arm was bandaged near the elbow. The exhaustion on his face was profound. The charismatic gleam was gone, replaced by the dull, haunted look of a man constantly fighting an internal battle. Thorne approached him slowly, his hand ready on his pistol, though Vance seemed barely conscious. "Mr. Vance," Thorne's voice echoed in the tight space. "The sermon is over. The tabernacle is closed." Vance's eyes fluttered open, dark and feverish. He looked at Thorne, not with surprise, but with a tired, profound malice. "You, the hound of the old world," Vance whispered, his voice dry and scratchy. "You crawl through the filth to find the truth, but you will not stop the renewal. The renewal is you murdering innocent people to prolong your own life," Thorne countered, pointing to the jars of blood. "You have a blood disorder, Vance, anemia. You've been using your followers to sustain yourself with transfusions. You chose O-negative donors, knowing that was your only chance of survival. The confession of faith was your medical screening." Vance managed a weak, horrific smile. "Survival? No, Detective, not survival. Transcendence. This body, this temple is weak, but the spirit is perfect. I needed the pure, untainted flow of the true believers to purge the corruption. The ash was the final purification. The blood was the fuel for the new Christ." He tried to push himself up, resulting only in a dizzying sway. His sickness was deep and pervasive. "And what about the families you poisoned?" Carver interjected, his voice trembling with controlled rage. "The Millers, their children. They gave freely," Vance hissed, a flash of the preacher's fire returning to his eyes. "Their confession was real. They understood the cost. The witnesses must be silenced, or the unwashed masses would pollute the true word. They were honored to be the final, necessary sacrifice." Thorne walked over to the armchair. On the armrest, there was a tiny, dried blood smudge. He realized the chair was a modified operating theater. Vance, or perhaps Holt, would sit the donor in the chair, draw the blood, and then Vance would immediately administer it, using the crude pump to force the type O negative blood into his own failing body. "Where is the source, Vance?" Thorne demanded, his pistol now leveled, not out of fear, but finality. "Who taught you this rudimentary, murderous process?" Vance just laughed, a hacking, desperate sound that ended in a rattle in his chest. "The Book of Man's Folly, Detective. The ancient yearning for immortality. I simply perfected the technique. I found the pure, simple hearts who needed a reason to die, and I gave them a reason to live for me. Thorne knew the case was finished. The evidence was irrefutable. The means, gas poisoning by Holt. The motive, Vance's desperate, selfish struggle for life. The victims, chosen for their blood. The terror was completely, horrifyingly human. As the deputies descended to secure the evidence, Thorne stepped back, the smell of blood and sickness clinging to his clothes. The Lamb of Renewal, defeated and frail, lay on his cot, just a man dying of his own affliction, yet responsible for the deaths of 25 people in his narcissistic attempt to conquer mortality. The new Christ was nothing but a killer with a weak heart. The arrest of Elias Vance was not met with applause, but with chaos. As the deputies led a pale, shackled Vance out of the tabernacle's hidden door, a large, volatile crowd of his most fervent followers had gathered. The freezing rain had stopped, replaced by a biting wind that whipped their furious shouts around the square. "He is the Lamb. You violate a righteous man. The old church sends its dogs to silence the truth." Sheriff Carver, positioned in front of the line of deputies, raised his voice, shouting through a megaphone to be heard above the din. "Elias Vance is a fraud. He is a medical charlatan and a murderer. He poisoned your neighbors, the Millers, the Clarks, to steal their blood. He is sick, and he used your faith to save himself." The crowd recoiled, not in belief, but in violent rejection. A brick flew, shattering the window of the sheriff's carriage. The deep emotional investment of the faithful was impossible to break with mere evidence. To them, Vance's pallor was a sign of his suffering for humanity, not his illness. Thorne, shielding Vance as they rushed him into a covered wagon, understood the psychology. Vance hadn't just offered salvation. He had offered community and meaning in a harsh industrial world that had stripped them of both. The truth was ugly, mundane, and left them with nothing. The beautiful lie of ascension was a comfort. Over the next 3 days, while Vance remained hospitalized under heavy guard, more for his failing health than for escape risk, Thorne and Carver focused on the victims' records and the finances of the tabernacle. The financial records were shockingly clear. Vance was not motivated by wealth. The collection plates were meager, most of the money going back into the upkeep of the tabernacle and the purchase of chemicals. His true currency was loyalty and secrecy. The victims were not randomly chosen. They were meticulously screened. Thorne found a small, personal notebook in Vance's cot, filled with elegant script. It wasn't scripture. It was a psychological assessment of his followers. Monsieur Miller, deeply anxious about daughter's future, requires purpose, will accept any directive if framed as protection. L. Clark, guilt over deceased wife, needs redemption, a final grand gesture, vulnerable to sacrifice narrative. Thorne realized the confession of faith sessions were dual purpose, medically screening for O-negative blood and psychologically screening for deep-seated despair and the willingness to follow a final destructive command. "He used their pain, Sheriff," Thorne said, sliding the notebook across the desk. "He didn't just ask them to die. He told them he was giving their lives the one thing they lacked: ultimate meaning. The truth is, he had them under total psychological control before the gas was even mixed. The greatest challenge now was breaking the remaining members of the inner circle. Jesse Holt was cooperating, desperate to save himself, but his confession was tainted by his clear mental instability and religious mania. They needed a clean witness. Thorne focused on Mrs. Hughes, the woman who had already shown doubt. He visited her small apartment, a cramped space above a bakery, where the smell of stale yeast was suffocating. "Mrs. Hughes," Thorne began, sitting across from her at a small table, "Elias Vance is a very sick man, a dying man. He used your faith to try and save himself. The reason you haven't been blessed yet is because you are not O-negative. He never intended to save you. He only wanted your admiration, to feed his ego while he bled others dry." Mrs. Hughes' eyes filled with slow, heavy tears. "I saw the paleness. I saw the weakness. But he said that was the mark of his suffering. He convinced me his weakness was a strength. That's how manipulators work, ma'am. They turn your empathy against you. The Millers and the Clarks, they weren't saved. They were used. Their blood is what kept him alive. Your husband's lungs, your debt, your fears. He used all of it to create a dependence. He needed you all to believe in him, so you would offer up your lives and your blood without resistance. Thorne detailed the pump, the pressure cooker, the gruesome medical setup. He spoke not of sin or divine justice, but of cold, hard, disgusting facts, a sick man's desperate medical fraud. The shield of faith finally crumbled. Mrs. Hughes broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "My neighbor," she choked out, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "Lois Perkins. She was scheduled for the blessing tonight. Vance told her it would be her final glorious confession." Thorne bolted upright. "Tonight? But Vance is in the hospital." "He prepared for this," Mrs. Hughes whispered, terrified. "He said the ritual of finality could be done in his absence, provided the blood was fresh and the ash was prepared. He left the instructions with Samuel Hayes." Samuel Hayes. A quiet, educated man, a former schoolteacher who had lost his job due to scandal and found refuge in Vance's cult. Hayes was the logistical backbone, the man who handled the schedules and correspondence. He was far more dangerous than the volatile Holt. "Lois Perkins," Thorne repeated, grabbing his coat. "Where does she live, Mrs. Hughes?" The investigation had gone from post-mortem analysis to a race against a ritualistic murder. Vance, even from his deathbed, was directing his final bloody act through a loyal disciple. The psychological conditioning was so absolute that his followers were continuing the crime in his name, believing they were still serving the new Christ. The terror of the Lamb of Renewal was not just in the man, but in the system of control he had built. The address for Lois Perkins was on the western edge of A.F. Condon, bordering the sparse, undeveloped woodlands. It was a dark, lonely area, fitting for a secretive ritual. The air was frigid, the ground slick with frozen slush. Thorne, Carver, and 3 deputies sped toward the house, the carriage wheels spitting gravel and mud. The clock was working against them. Hayes would be following Vance's final command precisely, adhering to the rigid schedule of the Ascensions. "Hayes is smart, detective," Carver warned, gripping the reins tight. "He was a teacher. He's organized. If Vance planned for this, he would have made it impenetrable." "He planned for my arrival, Sheriff," Thorne corrected, checking his revolver. "The Millers were his warning. The chaos at the tabernacle was his diversion. But he couldn't plan for a frightened woman with a nagging conscience." They arrived at a small, isolated cabin, its single window glowing with a soft, unsettling light. No smoke rose from the chimney. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the bare branches. Thorne signaled the deputies to surround the house silently. He and Carver approached the front door. It was locked. Through a gap in the drawn curtains, Thorne could see the interior. The scene was sickeningly familiar. A small dining table, cleared except for a bottle of the Rapture of Air, and a small charred cross. Lois Perkins, a woman in her late 40s, sat rigid in a chair. Her eyes were fixed, wide, and vacant. Across from her sat Samuel Hayes. He wasn't a fanatic, but a meticulous zealot. He wore a simple white cotton tunic over his street clothes, a parody of a priest. He was holding a small silver syringe, the thin needle glinting in the lamplight. "He's preparing the dose," Thorne hissed, pulling back. "He'll administer it by injection, not just inhalation. A direct dose of the gas into the bloodstream, a fail-safe immediate kill. He's adapting the method." Carver gripped his sidearm. "We go in now." "No, we have to draw him out," Thorne argued. "If we break the door, he might panic and administer the dose to himself or her. We need him alive, and we need her saved." Thorne found a loose piece of timber nearby. He positioned himself against the back wall, away from the window, and gave a sharp, deliberate rap against the wood. The sound resonated in the silence. Inside, Hayes froze. "The Lamb has sent a trial, Sister Lois." Hayes's voice was a dry, calm drone, audible through the thin walls. "The unclean world tries to stop the final confession. We must endure." Thorne rapped again, louder this time. "Samuel Hayes," Thorne shouted, his voice muffled against the wooden wall. "I am Detective Thorne. Your master, Elias Vance, is in custody. He confessed everything. He is a sick, dying man who used you to fuel his own body." "You are not a minister, Hayes. You are an accomplice to 25 murders." The silence inside was heavy, thick with internal conflict. "Lies. The hound of the old world is desperate," Hayes finally yelled, his voice strained with fury. "The Lamb gave me the final command. The true confession must be recorded." "Recorded?" Thorne exchanged a quick, confused glance with Carver. "Show yourself, Hayes. The game is over. Your master is finished." A moment later, a window on the opposite side of the cabin, an unsecured bedroom window, slid open. Hayes scrambled out, looking wild-eyed and desperate. He held nothing but a small, leather-bound book and a fountain pen. The syringe, thankfully, was left behind on the table. "He's going for the woods!" Carver yelled, and the deputies immediately took up the chase. Hayes was surprisingly fast, fueled by adrenaline and delusion, crashing through the undergrowth toward the dense darkness of the forest. Carver and the deputies pursued him relentlessly, the sounds of their labored breathing and snapping twigs fading into the distance. Thorne ignored the chase. His focus was Lois Perkins. He quickly forced the front door, splintering the frame. Lois Perkins sat motionless, her eyes wide, staring at the shattered table where the Rapture of Air bottle lay, slightly tipped, thankfully still sealed. Thorne rushed to her, checking her pulse, slow but steady. She was alive, but completely catatonic, paralyzed by the psychological conditioning. Thorne placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's over, ma'am. You're safe." He then looked at the table. Lying beside the syringe was a folded piece of paper. It was a detailed signed confession, pre-written identical in wording to the miller's note, complete with a blank space for the date. Hayes's role was to ensure the victim was compliant, administer the gas, and then fill in the date and leave the note, the final command. A few minutes later, Carver returned, winded and soaked, dragging a struggling, shouting Hayes. The leather-bound book had been ripped from his hands. "I got him, Detective." "He was still screaming about the final confession," Carver said, tossing the book onto the table. Thorne opened the book. It was a ledger of psychological vulnerabilities, a record of every private confession made to Vance during the blessing sessions, cross-referenced with their O-negative blood type. The final, horrifying truth. "This is the proof," Thorne said, looking at Hayes, who was now weeping hysterically. "Hayes, you were ensuring the purity of Vance's medical supply. That's all this was, a terrifying, calculated human crime." The immediate danger was over, but the full extent of Vance's horrifying system was now laid bare. Thorne had saved Lois Perkins, but the trauma of A.F. Condon had just begun. The capture of Samuel Hayes brings an end to the immediate threat, but the shocking truth about Elias Vance's medical motivations and psychological control is now revealed. Don't go anywhere. The final chapters will detail the explosive trial, the surprising fate of Elias Vance, and the lasting impact on the town. If you're still with us, make sure to like this video and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion. Your support keeps us bringing you the truth behind the terror. With both Elias Vance and Samuel Hayes in custody, the legal wheels of New York State began to turn slowly, grinding toward a high-profile murder trial. Vance, confined to a small private ward in the county hospital, was too ill to be moved to a standard jail, his fragile life hanging by a thread sustained by the very medical system he had twisted into a religious cult. Thorne, now a celebrated figure in the regional papers, remained in A.F. Condon. His task shifted from detection to documentation, ensuring the evidence, the pressure cooker, the lie, the victim notes, and Vance's chilling psychological ledger was meticulously prepared for court. He was deeply aware that the trial would be a battlefield of public opinion, where facts would clash violently with the fervor of Vance's remaining faithful. The true challenge lay in getting a jury to accept the pure, calculated evil of Vance's actions over the seductive power of his rhetoric. The defense attorney, hired by a small, loyal circle of remaining followers, is going to argue that Vance was merely a spiritual leader who inspired a communal suicide, the county prosecutor informed Thorne. They'll say the victims went willingly, that their confession of faith was their free will. The evidence is clear, Thorne countered, exasperated. Hayes administered the poison gas and then left the note. He even admitted he only left the notes after the victims were incapacitated. The psychological ledger proves coercion, not consent. And the O-negative blood type selection proves a predatory medical motive. We know that, Detective, the prosecutor sighed. But this is 1902. Juries are sympathetic to charismatic men of God, especially when they speak to the deep despair of the working man. We have to make Vance look like a desperate killer, not a tragic prophet. The key witness became Lois Perkins. She had been rescued from death, but the psychological scars were deep. She was nearly catatonic, only able to communicate in short, terrified whispers. Thorne spent days with her, guiding her through the trauma, slowly pulling her back to reality. Her survival was a direct refutation of Vance's narrative. He told me. Lois choked out during one session, her eyes darting nervously around the room. He told me my cancer, the stain on my body. Only the ascension could cleanse it. He said I would be reborn, pure. He lied, Lois, Thorne stated gently. He saw your weakness, your illness, and he exploited it. He didn't want to save your soul, he wanted your blood to save his own life. Your cancer didn't make you worthy of death. It made you vulnerable to his lies. This was the truth that had to be presented. Vance was a medical predator who targeted the most vulnerable, those with terminal illnesses, debilitating debt, or profound grief, knowing their desperation made them the most compliant donors and the most silent victims. The ascension was merely the price of the sustenance he required. Meanwhile, Samuel Hayes' trial began separately. He was a perfect example of secondary devotion, a man so broken by his own shame that he gave his life's purpose over to Vance's grand, destructive delusion. Hayes, stripped of Vance's influence, was a fragile, terrified man. The testimony of Jesse Holt, the simple, emotionally unstable chemist, confirmed the creation of the rapture of air gas. The testimony of Lois Perkins, though halting, confirmed the ritualistic coercion and the final planned confession. During Hayes' sentencing, the judge delivered a powerful indictment, focusing not on religious freedom, but on the exploitation of the desperate. Hayes received a life sentence, his own life effectively forfeited to Vance's destructive ego. The impending trial of Vance himself, however, overshadowed everything. The fear was that his failing health would grant him a deathbed absolution in the public eye. Then, a critical obstacle arose. The hospital informed the court that Vance's condition had worsened drastically. His body, ravaged by chronic blood disease and the stress of his capture, was shutting down. The doctors believed he would not survive long enough to stand trial. Thorne was furious. A technical death would turn the mass murderer into a martyr, confirming the followers' belief that he had been called away by a higher power and that the state had failed to save him. Thorne visited Vance one last time in the sterile, airless hospital room, which smelled of disinfectants and impending death. Vance was hooked up to monitors, a thin, almost skeletal figure, barely recognizable as the charismatic preacher. "You won't get to stand trial, Vance," Thorne said, his voice flat. "You'll die here alone in a hospital bed, not on a pulpit." No crowds, no glory, just a failed man with a bad disease. Vance's eyes, still piercing despite the fever, met Thorne's. He managed a weak, rasping whisper. "You have only confirmed the truth, detective. The physical body is nothing. The spirit, the word, will live on. I have transcended your law." "No," Thorne shot back, leaning in close. "You have not transcended anything. You are a footnote in a medical journal, a criminal who tried to cheat death by bleeding the weak. Your word will not live on. The confessions of the Millers and the Clarks, the truth of their murder, will overshadow your vanity. You are not a savior, Vance. You are just a patient who ran out of donors." Thorne knew he couldn't win the soul of Vance, but he could save the public from the lingering lie. He had to ensure that the facts of the crime, the human depravity, the medical exploitation, were all that remained. Elias Vance did not die quickly. He rallied, lingering in the hospital for 3 agonizing months, clinging to life with the same fierce, predatory determination that had driven his cult. This delay forced the court to hold a limited, highly controversial trial directly in the hospital's secured conference room, a sterile setting that stripped Vance of his theatrical power. Thorne was the prosecution's star witness, tasked with presenting the technical and psychological evidence that would dismantle the defense's argument of communal spiritual ascension. The atmosphere in the makeshift courtroom was tense. Vance, wheeled in on a medical gurney, pale but surprisingly alert, still held the hypnotic attention of his small, vocal group of loyalists seated in the gallery. He spoke little, letting his defense counsel argue the divine right of his actions. Mr. Vance's actions were born not of malice, but of inspiration. The defense lawyer boomed, addressing the jury. The victims chose their path. Their final written words were a testament to their free will. Thorne took the stand, his testimony focusing on the mundane, horrifying facts. "The defense claims free will. I claim calculated coercion," Thorne stated, holding up Vance's psychological ledger. "This book is not a religious text. It is a clinical assessment." Vance targeted those who were already psychologically fragile, those who were prepared to surrender their autonomy for a promise of final meaning. He then detailed the medical evidence, the discovery of the O-negative blood type across all victims, the equipment in the secret chamber, and the specific chronic illness plaguing Vance. "We have proven that Elias Vance was suffering from severe, chronic anemia, a condition that was killing him," Thorne testified, his voice clear and steady. He needed constant fresh blood transfusions. The confession of faith was not a sacrament. It was a medical screening process for type O-negative blood. The ascension was not a spiritual reward. It was a necessary cleanup operation to silence the donors who were keeping him alive. Thorne meticulously detailed the rapture of air, the gas concocted by Holt. He explained that Lois Perkins' life was saved not by spiritual intervention, but by the immediate human intervention of law enforcement. The defense was forced onto the back foot, reduced to arguing the legal definition of consent in the face of such manipulation. They tried to frame Vance's illness as a form of suffering that lent credence to his messianic claims. "Mr. Thorne, you claim this man is a criminal driven by medical desperation," the defense counsel challenged during cross-examination. "But are not all spiritual quests driven by a desperation to transcend the physical body? You are judging his methods, not his sincerity." "I am judging his actions, counsel," Thorne replied, unwavering. His methods resulted in 25 bodies seated at dining tables, all victims of a gas attack, all donors of a rare blood type. Sincerity does not negate premeditated murder. The ash was not from a divine altar. It was a chemical waste product. The stain was not a holy mark. It was the blood he had just drawn from his victims. This was not spiritual transcendence. This was a terrifying, systematic exploitation of human faith for personal biological survival. The key emotional moment came when the prosecution presented a new, unexpected piece of evidence. The final letter written by the miller's daughter, Sarah, just hours before her death. It had been overlooked in the initial search, found tucked into her prayer book. The letter was read aloud by the prosecutor. "I don't want to go. Father Vance says it's the only way to save my parents from the debt, that my spirit will be a beacon. He said it won't hurt, that I'll only feel the ash. But I'm scared. I just want to finish school. I wish he hadn't told us the truth about the debt. I wish he hadn't given us a choice that wasn't a choice at all." The letter shattered the image of willing martyrs. Sarah Miller, a 16-year-old girl, had been psychologically forced into an act of self-sacrifice to save her parents from mundane financial ruin, a weakness Vance had carefully identified in his ledger. Her choice was an ultimatum disguised as a blessing. The psychological terror of Vance's manipulation, turning the common anxieties of 1902 America, debt, illness, the struggle of mill life, into tools of coercion, finally swayed the jury. After 3 days of deliberation, the verdict came back, guilty on all 25 counts of first-degree murder. Vance received the death sentence. He showed no visible reaction, simply closing his eyes. The few remaining followers wailed in anguish, but their movement, stripped of its leader and its grand narrative, was definitively broken. Thorne watched the convicted man wheeled away, knowing the physical execution of Vance was now merely a matter of time and paperwork. But the true final test of the case was the fate of the town. The lie was exposed, but the scars remained deep and corrosive. The formal trial of Elias Vance, though brief and confined to a hospital wing, sent shockwaves across the nation, not for the spectacle of a messiah, but for the cold, calculated horror of his human motive. The narrative of the new Christ had been replaced by the story of the medical predator, a desperate dying man who had built a murderous system of supply and demand based on human faith. Vance did not live to see his sentence carried out. The day after the verdict, his long, ailing body finally succumbed to the chronic disease he had fought so ruthlessly to postpone. He died alone, in the sterile environment he had so desperately sought to escape, not as a martyr, but as a convicted criminal. The irony was a grim finality to his reign of terror. Thorne stayed in A.F. Condon for another week, ensuring the transition of the investigation to the state authorities was complete. He worked closely with Sheriff Carver, who was now tasked with the difficult job of helping the town heal. "They're starting to talk, Detective," Carver told Thorne one cold morning in the sheriff's office. "The families of the victims. They're finally accepting the truth. The rage at Vance is replacing the grief. That's the first step toward healing," Thorne noted. "They need to realize that their loved ones were victims of a crime, not participants in a flawed religion. That's the only way their memory survives the lie." The Tabernacle of Renewal, the former textile mill, was completely demolished by the town council a week later. The site, once a beacon of false hope, was soon to be cleared for a new library, a public institution dedicated to knowledge and truth, a symbolic rejection of the manipulative darkness Vance had cultivated. The real challenge, however, lay with the remaining former followers. They were now the deeply damaged collateral of Vance's ego, their lives shattered by the grotesque revelation. Thorne sought out Mrs. Hughes one last time. She was working again at the bakery, her hands kneading the dough with a new, quiet determination. She looked up when Thorne walked in, no longer afraid. "I read Sarah Miller's letter, Detective," she said, her voice steady. "The part where she wished she had finished school. That's what brought me back. He took our hope, and he turned it into despair. He made us believe that only death could bring meaning." "He used your circumstances against you, Mrs. Hughes," Thorne said. "You were strong enough to realize the lie. That takes more courage than any confession of faith." "The stain," she whispered, looking at her hands covered in white flour. "He called it the stain of the world. He was the stain, Detective, not us." Thorn saw in her eyes the beginning of a long, arduous process of reclaiming her life, rebuilding her self-worth after it had been so comprehensively destroyed. Her survival was the true testimony against Vance. Before leaving AF Condon, Thorn had a final, quiet conversation with Sheriff Carver. They stood by the train tracks, the rhythm of the approaching engine a deep, resonant hum in the cold air. "You've left a good mark on this town, Detective," Carver said, extending his hand. "You didn't just solve a murder, you stopped a delusion from becoming a permanent curse." "I just followed the evidence, Sheriff," Thorn replied, shaking his hand firmly. "The most terrifying crimes are the ones that are purely human. No ghost, no demon, just a man with a desperate, dark secret and an audience willing to listen." Thorn boarded the southbound train, leaving behind the gray, smoky air of the mill town. He carried with him the heavy burden of the case, the image of 25 people who had surrendered their lives for a beautiful, clinical lie. The story of Elias Vance faded from the front pages of the sensational newspapers, replaced by the next scandal, the next political upheaval of the burgeoning 20th century. But for those in AF Condon, the memory of the new Christ and the horrifying logic of his crimes would remain a cold, sharp lesson. That the most profound terror is not in the supernatural, but in the deepest, most twisted corners of the human heart, where desperation wears the mask of divinity and the price of salvation is a single necessary pint of blood. The ash of his false hope had settled, leaving behind the hard, unyielding truth of human nature.